Masechet Gittin daf peh. הרי את מותרת לכל אדם, אלא לאבא ולאביך ולאחי ולאחיך, לעבד ולגוי ולכל מי שאין לה עליו קידושין כשר. We saw in the previous Mishnah that if a husband makes a condition and says here, you are permitted to everyone except for the Uben, then that get is invalid. So in this Mishnah, we learn that's only if Reuven was someone that she would have been permitted to marry, and now the husband is limiting her before she should be able to marry anyone that she is permitted to. And the husband is thereby limiting it from, and now she can't marry Reuven. That's not a full get. The get has to be full according to Chachamim. However, if the husband says, you're permitted to everyone except for, and he lists any one of these people that she is anyway prohibited to, because these are adayot, these are chayave karet. He says, you can marry anyone, but not my father or your father. She's always prohibited to her father and her brother. And once a marriage starts, a woman becomes prohibited to her husband's close relatives also, forever. And even after divorce or death. And so, or similarly, my brother or your brother, she's prohibited to those people anyway. She's also prohibited to marry an Ived or a non-Jew, and all other people that Kiddushin is invalid. These are Isure Karet. If someone like a brother or a non-Jew comes and says he learns Hebrew and he says Haret Mikudeshet Li. He doesn't have to. You can say it in English. Doesn't matter. Any language. He says Haret Mikudeshet Li to a Jewish woman. And there's two witnesses under chuppah, and they do everything, even have a band and a violinist and a harp. Still, the kiddushin is not valid. And therefore, since the husband is not limiting her in any way, she was already prohibited from marrying any of these people. And in fact, if they tried to do a marriage, the marriage would be null and void. Therefore, these are not limitations on the divorce, and the divorce is totally valid. That's clause number 1. Clause 2. הרי את מותרת לכל אדם אלא אלמנה לכהן גדול, גרושה וחלוצה לכהן הדיוט, ממזרת ונתינה לישראל, בת ישראל ממזר ונתין, וכל מי שיש לה עליו קידושין, אפילו בעבירה pasul. If, however, the husband says you are permitted to everyone except, and she lists someone in this category, where the prohibition is also prohibited marriage, but these prohibitions are lower level, only a lav. And in these cases, if any one of these people tries to do kiddushin, the kiddushin actually will be valid. It's prohibited and you have to leave, but the kiddushin does stick. They are in fact married. In these cases, the get is invalid because he is limiting her. She could have married these people, although it would be prohibited. Nevertheless, she could have married them in a prohibited way, and now he is limiting her marriage options. So what are the examples? Almana to a Kohen Gadol. In general, if an almana, a Kohen Gadol has to marry only a betula. If she is almana, Kohen Gadol is not allowed. A gerusha or chalutza may not marry a regular Kohen. But if they do, the marriage is, in fact, a valid marriage. Now, these two here are only here because they're in the usual list of chayavei lavin. It wouldn't actually apply in this case because, in this case, the husband is giving his wife a get, so they are already a gerusha. So there's no point in saying that she had been an almana or that she had been a gerusha and halutza beforehand, and now he's giving her a get. This woman's going to be prohibited to a kohen gadol and to a regular kohen as a gerusha, no matter what. But the point is, if he says here, this is your get, but you may not marry a kohen. That is not a limitation in the divorce. That is a limitation in the divorce because she could have married them illegally, and the marriage is valid. Also, a mamzeret or netina when Gibeonites who converted under false pretenses to a Yisrael, not allowed, but it's only allowed. Or the other way around, a woman who is a full Jew, a kosher Jew who marries a mamzer or a natin, and any other case that is that the kiddushin is valid, because she could have married those people and the husband says, here's your get, but you're permitted to everyone except those people, that is a limitation in the divorce, and any limitation in the divorce is no good. All right, kelala deresha. Notice that it says a kelal, and anyone, and here also, and anyone. What is that coming to include? Le'atuyesh ad hayav keretot. Any other relationship that would be hayav karet, where the kiddushin is invalid. Kelala desefa le'atuyesh ad hayav lavin. And the klal in the second half is to include any other prohibition that's only a lav. Kegon, Amoni, Moavi, Nitine, Misri, Va'adomi, all of these different nationalities are prohibited in marriage, but these are only Isure Lavin. Be'amine Rava Merav Nachman. Chutz mekidushe katan mahu. We're going to have a whole series of other categories. If the husband says, you are permitted to everyone except that, is it valid or not? So he says, you can marry anyone who's an adult, but you cannot marry a minor. Now, what about that? Is that considered a limitation or not? Do we say right now this is a minor, and a minor can't get married anyway? A minor boy can't go ahead and give kiddushin and get married. Therefore, you'll say it's not a limitation and it's a full get to anyone who's now eligible at this stage, and therefore the get is valid. Or do we say, well, even though it's a little boy now, he's going to grow up and be an adult, and then she won't be able to marry this person in the future. So it is limiting her marriage options, and therefore the get is invalid. That's the question. Amaleh tinituha. Rav Nachman esat. Rava es Rav Nachman. Rav Nachman answered, as actually we already learned this in a baraita. Ketana mitgareshet b'kiddushe aviha. That a minor woman can receive a get if she had been, if her father had received kiddushin on her behalf. A minor girl, even though she can't receive kiddushin herself, her father can receive kiddushin for her, right? Bitech mikodeshet li, and he gives the coin to the father. That's a full deoraita kiddushin, and in order to get out of that, the husband actually can give the get directly to the minor. That's permitted. Now we ask why? Hamai but how could that be? Doesn't getting into the marriage and leaving the marriage have to be parallel? And just like a minor can't go into the marriage, how could a minor receive a get for herself? Rather, we say since, even though right now she is a minor, but she will be able to, in the future, will be able to marry herself and divorce herself. So even though she's a minor now, we anticipate and say, well, since she will be able to, in the future, she can already receive her get now. So too here, even though the boy is a minor, and right now he can't enter into marriage, but potentially in a few years, he will be able to, and therefore we take that into account now, and therefore that stipulation is a limitation on the severance, and the get is invalid. Next case, chutz min hanoladim mahu. Husband says, here is your get, you can marry anyone except the unborn, right? Those who will be born, anyone who's a fetus right now, you cannot marry ever. Is that a limitation? On the one hand, you could say, right now, they are not born. They are not people. They don't exist. And so that's not a limitation. Or do you say, well, just wait a few months and they will be born. And then they will grow up. And then they will be marriageable. And so this is a limitation. It's not a full severance. And therefore the get is invalid. We learned this in the Mishnah. It says, "Le'aved ulgoy imita aved v'goy name avidi de mi gayeri." It says that if a husband says you can marry anyone except eved or a goy, we said in the Mishnah that's not considered a limitation because kiddushin does not work for them. However, if you're going to plan for the future, so it's possible that an eved or a goy, the eved could be freed, the goy could convert, and then they will be full Jews. So, but we don't take that into account. We don't say, well, since they could be full Jews one day and therefore be marriageable, therefore it's not a full severance. We don't say that. We look at the situation right now. For the katan, it's true. Even though they're a katan now, we treat them on account of the future, like they were because of their potential to be adults. But Here, in this case, right now, it's totally Evid, totally Goy, and we don't take into account that they might convert. So it should be the same for someone who is not born. Right now, they are not born, so we don't have to take them into account, and it's a full severance. The get is good. But we reject that comparison. The non-Jew or the slave, they are not standing ready to convert, right? Most likely they will never convert. Most non-Jews don't never convert. Many slaves remain Eved Kanani their entire lives. So there's no guarantee. It's not actually unlikely that they will convert. Whereas the unborn stand ready to be born, and just wait 9 months. They are going to be born. Okay, some might have a miscarriage. That's rare, right? But this is the automatic, natural process is that they will be born, and therefore you cannot compare them, and maybe you could make a difference in an Eved or a non-Jew who are not likely to convert. So then you don't have to take that into account. But someone unborn, where the natural process is that they will be born and be marriageable, maybe that would be a lack of full severance. Next case, chutz mi ba'al achota mahu. Husband says, you can marry anyone except your sister's husband. What about that? This is the unique one of the adayot that the status of that person actually could change over time. A person is not allowed to be married to two sisters, not at the same time, not even if he divorces one, and then he still cannot marry the other one. However, if one of the sisters dies, then he is permitted to marry let's say he's married to sister A, and she dies, then he is permitted to marry sister B. So in this case, right now, let's say they're all alive, and we have the husband and the wife, and he is divorcing her, and that wife has a sister, and she has a husband, and let's say that sister and that husband, they get divorced. Okay, so that husband is out of the picture. So that sister is single. And the husband is also single. So the husband's now the husband divorcing his wife says, here, you can marry anyone except for your brother-in-law or your ex-brother-in-law, right? You are not allowed to marry. Now, that at this current stage, that relationship would be irva, because that husband was married to the sister. He will not be able to marry the wife, and so that would be included in the first category of isure karet. And over there, the get is valid. So, do we say that we look at the way it is right now, or do we say, well, even though right now it's prohibited marriage, it could very well be that the sister will die, the one who was married to that guy, and then it will be permitted for the wife who's being divorced to marry her former brother-in-law. And so, since in the future it's a permitted marriage, therefore, even right now, it's a limitation in the severance, and the get is no good. Okay, good question. Nachman says, we already learned this. Why are you asking this question? It's the same thing as Eved and Goy, who may convert. And so there's a possibility in the future that they may convert, but we don't take into account that possibility. We say right now, they are not eligible for marriage, and therefore the get is good. There's no limitation of severance. The same thing here. It's possible, but we could look at the way it is right now. But then we reject that and say gerut la shechicha mita shechicha. Conversion is not found often. Very few people convert, and that's why in the Mishnah we don't take into account a possible future conversion of the Eved or the Goy. However, death, that is common, happens to everyone, and there's a 1 out of 2 chance which sister will die first. All right, so 1 out of 2 chance that other sister will die first, and then this current wife will be permitted to marry her former brother-in-law. And so since it is likely, maybe we do have to take it into account, and therefore it is a limitation on the severance and an invalid get. Next question. Chutz mi zenutech mahu. The husband says, here is your get. You can marry anyone you want as long as you go through a marriage ceremony. But here's what you're not allowed to do. You can't have an extramarital relations with anybody. That is prohibited to you. And if you do that, this get does not apply to that. You are not divorced with regard to zinut only. But you're fully permitted to marry anyone you want. Is that a limitation? Mahu b'nisuin halashir. On the one hand, we could say it's a good get because with respect to marriage, he did not leave anything out. She can marry anyone she wants. So good. So that's a total divorce. Or do we focus on her possibilities, not possibilities for marriage only, but her possibilities for relations? And if she wants to have bi'ah with anyone, within marriage or without and outside of marriage, she has to be permitted to, in terms of the first husband. And if he's holding back on that, that's considered not a full severance. Amar le tini tuha. Nachman said, we learned this also in the Mishnah. La'aba ulavicha. The first case was, here, you can marry anyone except for my father and your father. Ubemai. And what kind of prohibition? What is she doing with her father or my father? If she's marrying them, can they get married? There is no marriage with a father. If the father goes to a daughter and says Haret Mikudeshet, this is totally invalid. It's not even a ceremony. Ela lav biznut, rather, it's talking about that it's a relationship of zinut. It's a erva also, but it's outside of marriage. And yet, the Mishnah only specifies that only regarding abba avich, other close relations, where because it's erva, it's totally prohibited, karet, that's where the get is okay. We don't consider that a limitation. But if it was a different person, someone not related, someone that she is permitted to be with, then you would say that is a limitation. And the husband has to permit her to go and marry or even be mizana with anybody. Not that we're encouraging her to do that, but that has to be an option open, available to her. The husband, it's not a full severance if the husband is holding her back as an eshet ish, if she should go be mizana. Okay, so that's the proof, but then we reject it. Dilma b'nisuin, da'avar v'insav. Maybe it is in fact, even in the case of the father, it's talking about nisuin. Yes, it's in fact when the father goes and transgresses, and he says here, haret mikudeshet li, and he tries to do a marriage ceremony, even though it's not going to be effective, but just trying to do that is what the husband is prohibiting, and so there is no limitation in that because she couldn't do that anyway. But that's specifically what he has in mind when he says except for father, meaning a nisuin ceremony, and did not have in mind zinut. And therefore, according to this, if he holds back regarding zinut from anyone, maybe that in fact would be a good get. So there's no proof from here. Husband says you're permitted to be with anybody, marriage or mizana, right? That's not dependent on the previous question, but you can only have normal relations, but not shelot kedarka from the back. That you can't do that with anyone. Mahu. So is that a severance? Bichdarka ha lashir. On the one hand, he's totally permitted her to be with anyone in the normal way. So that's a good get. Or do we say, since the pasuk says mishkebe isha in plural, that means there are two forms of Torah recognized acts of bi'ah, and so both of them are recognized as legal acts. Therefore, she has to be permitted to perform those acts with anyone that she wants. And any holding back of that by the husband is in fact a lack of severance, and the get is no good. All right, that's a question. Next question, we don't answer that one. Husband says, here, you are permitted to marry anyone, but your new husband cannot nullify your vows. I want to retain the right to nullify your vows. You can be married to that person, you do everything that a wife would do with a husband, except for nullifying vows. I keep that right. What do we say about that? So regarding the marriage itself, he didn't hold anything back. Go marry, be happy, build a family, have build a home with anyone you want. So it's okay. But Pasuk says her husband can sustain the vow, or her husband can nullify the vow. Since that's something that's a right given to a husband, and the first husband's going to keep that right, that's not a full severance, right? You have to give over the woman entirely so that the new husband can have all of those rights, and it's not a good severance. We don't answer it. Chutz mitirumatich mahu b'nisuin. So the husband says, you can marry that other person, but not with regard to the laws of terumah. Right? For terumah, I want you to still, let's say he's a kohen, I want you to still be married to me, be under my household, and you could still eat terumah, and not be under his household. Let's say he's a Yisrael. See, the problem is, even if she marries a Kohen, she's a divorcee, and divorcee can't marry a Kohen. So even if that guy's a Kohen, she still wouldn't be able to marry the terumah from the new husband. So let's explain it that we're talking about the terumah from the first husband. I only want you can still have my terumah, that's the condition. So what do we say? He said you can marry anyone you want. So that's totally fine, even though he's holding her back to be within his household regarding terumah, but that's nothing. Or do we say the law of terumah says anyone who is under the husband's household, anyone who's the purchase of his money, right? Anyone like slaves and anything, even animals that the husband owns, can eat terumah. So do we say that this is kinyan kaspo, and that would mean that the wife continues to be his kinyan kaspo, and that's a lack of severance if he's still retaining some rights over her husband, over his wife, and therefore this is a limitation of the severance and not a good get. Next question: Chus mirushatech mahu. You can marry anyone except the right to inherit I'm keeping. Your new husband cannot inherit you. Do we say b'nisuin ha'ala shiyer or di'amar lish'ero v'yarash ota ketiv? On the one hand, she can marry anyone. So for all the laws of marriage, she can totally marry everyone. So that's a full severance. Or do we say Lish'ero hakarov elav mimishpachto v'yarash ota, that someone who is his flesh, of his family, can inherit her. That means the person who inherits her is her husband, and therefore by saying, okay, you can marry anyone, but I inherit you, basically saying, but you're still my wife, and so he's holding back something essential. It's a very interesting question, because they're getting at different aspects of a marriage. A marriage is a multifaceted agreement. While the permission to have sexual relations is an essential part of the definition of marriage, but these other aspects are also important. So the question, are they fundamental, essential parts of the definition of marriage, or are they incidental rights, but ones that can be separated from the essential definition of marriage? So these are all really interesting conceptual questions. His husband says, you can marry anyone as long as you don't get married with a shtar. You could use bi'ah or you could use kesef, but you can't get married with a shtar. But otherwise you can marry anyone. Mahu. Mi amrina nefshad mekadesh la bekesef or bi'ah. She can marry anyone. She'll just use kesef or bi'ah. So there's no limitation on her marriage possibilities. And it's a good get. Or do we say the pasuk says she will leave and she will be with the second man? So to be with means to have kiddushin, and so those are all compared to each other. In this case, in addition, v'yatzea is with a shtar, right? It's with a get, and so v'hayita certainly has to be able to be with a get. And the point is that any limitation on the mechanism of Kiddushin also is a fundamental limitation and therefore would not be a good get. All of these stand unresolved. All right, next Mishnah. Gufo shel get. Okay, we're almost all the way at the end of the Masechet, and now it tells us what the get actually says. Hare at muteret lechol adam. This is the essential clause. It has to say you are permitted to everyone. We kind of knew this because we just saw the exceptions, except for this person or other conditions. Okay, but this is fundamental. That's the opinion of Rabbanan. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, V'den teheve lichi minai, sefer terukhin, v'gedet shebukin, v'get peturin, limhach lehit naseba, lechol gevar deyit sebiyin. Rabbi Yehuda says, and more expanded formula, not only does it have to say you're permitted to everyone, you have to say v'den, right? This will be for you from me a scroll of divorce, and shivukin, a letter of leave, and piturin, you are dismissed, so that you can marry, to go, limhach, to go and marry, litnaseba, marry any person that you wish to, that you want to. So it has to say all that expanded formula. Gufo shel get shichrur. Now this is different from get shichrur. If an owner wants to free a slave, a maidservant, he says, he has to write, Hareat bat chorin, hareat leasmech. You are now free, or you are on your own. Pishita, amar la leishto hareat bat chorin, lo amar velo kelum. Now what if you mix up the formulas? If he tells his wife, you are now a free woman, that does not work, right? Because Frida, she was always free. Even the wife is free. So saying that now you're free, she was never a slave, so that doesn't effectuate a divorce. But what if the other way around? That also is simple. He tells her shivcha, you can go marry anybody. That doesn't say anything because she is owned. She is a slave, and saying you can marry anybody doesn't acquire her freedom. She needs to acquire her body back as in her freedom, her ownership over herself. Amar la leisha, here's the question. Hareat lasmech mahu. The second formulation of freedom was you are on your own. What if instead of saying that to his maidservant, he says that to his wife? Is that valid? Legamre kamarla? Does he mean, right, you're totally on your own? Or is it only for work? If it's totally you're on your own, meaning you're totally free, you're disconnected from me, therefore you can marry anyone you want, and so that's a full severance, and that's good. Or when you say to a slave, it means you are your work is your own, right? I don't own your body and the work that you have anymore. So that works for a maidservant, but not for a wife, and therefore it's not good enough. Amar le Ravina, le Rav Asher. Tashema. Here I have an answer. Ravina says from the Mishnah. Gufo shel get shichrur, hareat bat chorin, hareat lasmech. Uma abda dikni le gufe, ki amar le hareat lasmech, kane gufe, isha de la kini gufa, lo kol sheken. Learn it from a Kal Vachomer. Regarding the get shichrur for Eved, if he writes, bat chorin, you are free, or you are on your own. So if for a slave where she, a maidservant, has to acquire her own body, which is a lot. She has to regain ownership of herself. And he says, here you are on your own. She regains her own self, her own body. So for a woman, all the more so, she acquires herself. She doesn't have to acquire her ownership in her body. All she has to do is acquire her right to marriage. So since that's less of an acquisition, so if this formula works for a greater acquisition, then certainly it will work for a lesser acquisition. Still doesn't mean that shichrur will work, because this is the wrong category. But the point of leatzmech, which is a more general phrase, right? You are your own, so that means you are your own for everything. So therefore should be good. Amar le Ravina Rav Ashe. Amar lo le'avdo en li isik becha mahu. What if he says to his slave, I have no business with you? Does that work? We saw a similar phrase regarding land, right? I have no business in this land. I renounce ownership. Is that sufficient? Amar le Rav Chanin le Rav Ashe. Ve'amri la Rav Chanin mehozna al Rav Ashe. Tashema. Detanya mocher avdo legoy asar harut. Ve'serich get shichrur merabo rishon. Amar Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel במדבר הם אומרים שלא כתב עליו עונו, אבל כתב עליו עונו, זה שחרורו. So Rav Chanin says to Rav Ashe, and some say Rav Chanin Chazat says Rav Ashe. Here we can learn it from this braita that says if a person sells a Jew sells his Eved Kanaani to a non-Jew, he's not allowed to do that because this Eved Kanaani, he has to keep mitzvot like a woman has to keep mitzvot. He has to keep Shabbat. And he's going to sell to a non-Jew, and non-Jew is going to make him work on Shabbat. So therefore, since it's not allowed, that's a renunciation of ownership. And in terms of the Jew, he goes free. Now, the non-Jew is not going to listen and may still work him, but once the non-Jew frees him, then the Jew won't be able to get him back. And not only that, the Jew, we force him to write a get shechirur from that first owner to make sure that that's it, you're totally free. And other places we learn he actually has to go and pay to redeem the slave and then let him go free. Rashbag says, when does he have to write a get shichrur in addition? Only if he didn't write an ono. But if he write an ono, then we can consider that ono as a get shichrur. My ono, Amar Rav Sheshet, echatav la, lecheshet tivrach mimeni, en li esek becha. An ono is a statement that he would write that says, if you run away from your new master, I have no business with you. I renounce ownership from you. So if you wrote that, then that's the same as saying, I free you, even though he's not saying, I free you right now, by saying, when you run away from your next owner, I will have no ownership over you. I have no business over you. So that's the same thing. That's effectively getting rid of him. Anyway, the proof is from the fact that this baraita uses the phrase en li esek becha and says that's a proper formula for saying I have no ownership over you. And therefore, if an owner would say to his slave en li esek becha, that is a valid formula of freedom. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, Veden tehevi lichi minai sefer teruchin ve'igeret shibukin b'mai kami palge. How come Rabbanan say you only have to have the short formula, you're permitted to everyone, and Rabbi Yehuda says you also have to write, and this will be to you, from me, a scroll of divorce, a letter of leave. Why do you have to add all that? B'mai kami palge. Rabbanan said yadayim shel mochot havi anadayim ve'af agav de la katav la v'den mochecha milta de behai gita ka megaresh la. Rabbanan say that an ambiguous formula, a yad is like a shorthand, an ambiguous abbreviation is still valid, right? Because we could figure out what you mean. And therefore, even if you didn't say, this is your get, it's obvious that it is, right? If he's handing her a bill of divorce and he's saying, you are permitted, it says in it, you are permitted to marry anyone. So obviously, that's a bill of divorce, right? It's written in a bill. It says you can marry anyone. He is giving it to her. So you don't have, it's implied, but it's obvious that this is a bill of divorce, and you don't have to specify it. But Rabbi Yehuda sabar yadayim shel mochot lavya yadayim v'tamad chatav la den demochecha milta debehai gita ka megaresh la la katav la v'den amri b'dibura garsha ushtara re'aya be'almahu. Rabbi Yehuda says if you have an unclear formula, then it's not valid as an abbreviation or a pointer. It's not valid by itself, and therefore it is only a good get because it says specifically this is your get, where it's proven that this is through this get he is divorcing her. But if he didn't write them, then it looks like he's divorcing her orally, right? Here is your get. He's just saying you are permitted, and the shtar, which doesn't say in it this is the get, maybe that's just a proof Here's a document, a receipt, a proof for later on that says you have been permitted to anyone. But it looks like maybe that's just a receipt, but not actually the get. It could be that someone would make the mistake that he has in mind that his words are effectuating the get, and the document is only a proof. But that would not work because you need a document to make a divorce. You can't divorce a wife orally. And so, and since this is ambiguous, and Rabbi Yehuda says an ambiguous term is invalid, that's why Rabbi Yehuda says you have to write explicitly, this is the get, the bill of divorce in the get. Amar Abaye, Haiman de Katav Gita, La dichtov v'den, de mashma v'din, ela v'den. We're going to see a list of about 10 spelling mistakes that could happen, and therefore make sure to spell it in the following way so that it won't be ambiguous and someone won't come to read it in the wrong way. And you have to write, when you write the word den, don't write it with a yod, because that could be explained as din, right? And the law is that I divorce you. It's not the law, it's saying this is. So therefore write it without a yod, because without a yod, it can still be understood as den, and would not be understood as din. V'la ketav igeret, temashma igeret, ela igeret. Okay. Don't write igeret with a yod, because then it could sound like igart. If you have not strayed, committed adultery. Only if you have not committed adultery, then this is divorce, which sounds like it's dependent on a condition. But rather, write it without a yod, because without a yod, there's no possibility that you could read it as two words, gart, if. Rather, it will certainly be one word, igeret, which means a letter. When you write limhach, write it without a yod, meaning to go. That's what the verb means, limhach, right? Go and marry. But if you write it with a yod, then someone might read it separately. You have to remember that in the olden days when they wrote things, they didn't always leave full spaces between words. They kind of go one into the other. And so it was easy to read. Now, one word is two, or two words is one. So you could write it li. You could read it li mehach if you add a yud, right? From me to you, this. But that doesn't make any sense. We want to make sure it says that you can go. So write it without a yod. Also, make sure to write the he as a he and not as a het. V'la lichtov limhach demashma ki chucha. Chucha means a joke, right? And here, this is a joke, right, that I'm giving you. No, it's not a joke. This is something very serious. So don't write a het, write a he. Di ti hevyin, di tisbiyin, telata yudin demashma tehevyan vetisbeyan. Okay, not all. We're going to see a few more spelling things. Not all of these words were in the Rabbi Yehuda's formula. Some of them are in an expanded formula that later was in common use. When it says to be, right, hevyin, meaning to marry, or yesibin, whoever you want to, right, whoever you choose and agree to marry, this should be written with 3 yuds, so that it means that you will marry and will agree to be with. Whereas if you write it without a yod, it just sounds like a plural, that they marry and they agree to be with. Even though this is an unusual spelling, this is not the way you'd spell it normally, but we purposely write it in this unusual way so that it's completely unambiguous. Ve'lorche de levav de teruchin v'levav de shibukin. De mashma teruchin u'shbikin. Also, you should lengthen the vav in the word teruchin and shibukin. Teruchin, divorced, and shibukin, that you are left. Right, you are out. He has left you. That because by writing it with a vav, teruchin, shibukin, it means it's a description that you are now going to be divorced. Whereas if you write it with a yod, then that is in the past. You have been divorced. You have been left. And it shouldn't be describing as they were before, but rather their current state, that with this you are now divorced, you are now left to marry someone else. Ve'lodche levav de chedu de mashma uchedi. It says in that expanded formula, it says uchedu, meaning now, from now on, you are married to me, but from now on you are not. So you should write the kedu with an elongated vav. Because if you write it with a short vav, it might look like a yud, and that word kedi means for nothing, and that's not the right meaning. Right? Yud and vav, they wrote in olden days, you look at manuscripts, the yuds were written quite long, almost like a vav, and so make sure to elongate the vav so it can't be a yud. V'la lichtov le'it naseba, de mashma de la yit naseba, ela lehit naseba. When you write that you are now free to marry anyone you want, so do not write it with an aleph, le'it naseba, even though that's a proper Aramaic formula, because you could possibly read it as two words, la yit naseba, you may not marry. So instead of using an aleph, use a he, lehit naseba, that you may get married. Ibaya lehu, ba'inan veden, or la ba'inan veden. Do we need the word this, or you can leave out that word? Tashema dat ken rava begite ech pelanya bar pelanya patar vetarech yat pelonita in tete dehavat in tete min kodam dena miyomar denan ul alam v'ilu den la ka'amad. Here we have a proof that you don't have to write den, because Rava would write in his get, right here, this is get, shows how this person, this son of this person, dismissed and divorced that wife, right, the son of that person who was his wife beforehand, and from this day and forever they are now divorced. And so you see, he had this nice formula, but didn't say veden, that this is your get. So therefore you don't have to write it. But then we reject that. No, ulita'amich kulehu mi ka'amar ela ba'inanacha name ba'inan. No, wait, in this formula, does it say all the other things that are necessary to write? No, but obviously they're necessary, right? Rava, we were just giving a snippet of some things that he put in that are good to put in, but this is not a comprehensive list of everything that you have to put in. And so maybe, in fact, then is also something that one must include in the get, even though it's not here in Rava's formula. Baruch Adonai leolam. Amen ve'amen.